Good evening, welcome to Insights, Newcastle University's public lecture series. I'm Martin Farr, co-chair of the programme. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the latest of our virtual lectures this semester. The past lectures this semester can be watched on our YouTube channel, and we have a very extensive archive of previous lectures which can be watched and listened to on our webpage. This evening we are hosting, I think, probably the most eminent historian of trauma in the world, Professor Joanna Bourke of Birkbeck, University of London. She will be speaking on a global history of sexual violence. And after her presentation, at about 6 o'clock, I'll be fielding questions and answers. If you would like to ask a question of our speaker, there are two ways you can do it. One is on Twitter with our handle @InsightsNCL. The other is in the chat box on your screen, and I'll be able to pose your questions to Joanna at about 6 o'clock. I'll hand over now in a recorded slot to the introducer of today's lecture, my colleague in politics, Dr Matt Davies, also a member of the Insights Public Lectures Committee.
Hello, and welcome to tonight's Insights Virtual Lectures, Newcastle University's Public Lectures series. My name is Matt Davies, and I'm a senior lecturer in international political economy at Newcastle University. It is an honor tonight to introduce Joanna Bourke, who is Professor of History at Birkbeck College, University of London. Professor Bourke is the author or editor of over a dozen books covering a wide range of topics exploring how the human condition is historically situated. She's written histories of husbandry and housewifery, how war damaged the bodies and masculinity in the Great War and in the Second World War, how play, as shaped by warfare and militarism, has become part of our everyday lives. She has written historical examinations of pain, of rape, and of fear, and of the intimacy of face-to-face killing in 20th century warfare. Her newest book, now forthcoming in November, is Loving Animals, Reflections on Bestiality, Zoophilia, and Post-Human Love, a very different project from the previous ones. Professor Bourke is currently the principal investigator on a Wellcome Trust-funded project called Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters. She is speaking tonight on the global history of sexual violence, which will be the title of a forthcoming volume, which she is researching in the context of this research project. I hope you enjoy the lecture tonight.
Hello, my name is Joanna Bourke. I'm really thrilled to be able to talk to you today about one of my pet subjects. And it's a pity that we can't do this face-to-face, but I hope that we can generate some discussion when I am done. I'm going to just talk for about half an hour, something like that, and then we've got time to talk, because this is a project that's really deep to my heart. I'm writing a book called A Global History of Sexual Violence, which will be published by Princeton University Press. I think first thing to point out is I think it's actually foolhardy sometimes to attempt to write a truly global history of sexual violence. After all, 19th century peasant women in Ireland who are often abducted as a way of forcing marriage have little in common with date-raped high school students in 21st century America. The girls and women violated by the Red Army soldiers, 1945, cannot realistically be compared to Dalit women raped by men of higher castes in India today. The options available to sexually abused women in the occupied territories of Palestine or in Rio's shantytowns are different to those existing for German citizens. And French wives who acquiesced to sexual intercourse with their husbands as the easier option bear no resemblance to bushwives in Sierra Leone. It matters if you are a boy victim or a man. It makes a difference if the attacker wields a machete or waves an unsigned employment contract. When the time frame of the analysis extends over 2 centuries, and my work extends from the 19th century to the present, the risks, of course, of emphasizing similarities over differences are exacerbated even further. Any assumption that sexual violence is a universal experience insults the specificities of an individual's history. In other words, terror is always local. Now, one major school of second wave feminism from the 1970s to the 1990s contended that rape is indigenous, not exceptional to women's conditions, that every woman from 9 months to 90 years is at risk, and rape is a form of global terrorism. These are themes that come up time and again in that second wave. The most influential exposition of this view is, of course, Susan Brown Miller's insistence in her classic Against Our Will, which was published in 1975, that from prehistoric times to the present, rape has played a critical function. It is nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear. Now, such generalizations have, of course, been totally undermined by feminists for a long period now. Terror is also unevenly distributed. Kimberlé Crenshaw introduced this really important term, intersectionality. In other words, some groups of people are more vulnerable than others. These include girls and women, minoritized ethnic communities, LGBTQ and non-binary, and people with physical and learning difficulties. Crucially, and this is what Crenshaw's crucial point was, these identities are not discrete badges of vulnerability. In other words, their effects are cumulative. This is what intersectionality means, the cumulative effect. Now, the first difficulty that everyone must face when exploring sexual violence is, of course, quantitative. Impediments to assessing the extent of sexual violence are legion. We don't know how many people perpetrated rape. We don't know how many victims. The available statistics we do know are certainly underestimates. Underreportage is rife due to the reluctance of victims to publicly complain and, when they do, to have their protests heard and responded to. The second difficulty is definitional. What is sexual violence? Now, we can all agree, I think, that it includes rape, sexual assault, sexualized abuse, and non-consensual sexual activity. But what about consensual sexual activity between people under the legal age of consent? What about female genital mutilation? Or the circumcision of boys? Are these things sexual violence? When a stranger brandishes a knife, we recognize that a violent act is being perpetrated. But what about when a husband gradually wears down a no? Sex trafficking of young girls is a form of violence, sexualized violence. But is voluntary sex work by adult women anxious to have enough food on the table to feed their children also abusive? What about when a girl or woman quickly marries someone solely in the hope that he will protect her from armed violence from other men? Now, for the purpose of this talk, at least today, I'm going to adopt a definition that I used in my book, Rape, A History from the 1860s to the Present. Now, in that book, I define sexual violence as any act called such by a participant, victim, or third party. Third party is actually quite important because the suffering of infants, of young children, or those with very severe learning disabilities can only, of course, be described by third parties. For the purpose of my analysis, so long as someone says that an act is rape or sexually violent, that claim is accepted. It allows for multiple definitions of what is meant by sexual. After all, what is regarded as sexual has changed over time and geographical region. It also allows for culturally distinctive and time-specific definitions of non-consensual, unwanted, coerced, all of which have varied widely. So in other words, this definition enables us to problematize and historicize every component of the complex interactions between sexed bodies. The definition is also skeptical about legal dogmas. Throughout the world, the law is parsimonious about what it designates as violent or aggressive sexual behavior. In other words, it fears the criminalization of ordinary male misbehavior. Furthermore, laws around sexual violence can be dramatically transformed within relatively short periods of time. For example, one day marital rape is impossible, the next it's a heinous crime. An adult who has sex with a person under the age of consent is by law engaged in a criminal act. But the legally binding age changes by a simple legislative vote and can, in fact, in the US, for example, differ very dramatically when the offender simply steps across a state line. Vast differences exist between jurisdictions in terms of definitions. For example, is rape an act against the will of a victim or without her consent? Does rape require emission of semen? Can a man be violated? There are also evidential requirements. Is proof of violence necessary? Does there need to be a witness? Can the victim's sexual history be tabled as evidence? And of course, punishments dramatically vary. Fine, whipping, imprisonment, death. So what are some of those big themes that we can identify when exploring global violence, global sexual violence? I think we can see similar themes emerging, although reflected and refracted through the lens of specific historical, institutional, and cultural contexts. The first is the difficulties victims everywhere experience when attempting to speak about their ordeal. Recalling the details could resurrect painful memories, increase anxiety, trigger psychological disorders. It might also compel victims to instigate damaging regimes of self-management, such as drinking to excess or avoiding nighttime socializing. It is common for victims to feel an overwhelming sense of shame, although the degree of shame varies by region, religion, caste, and class. Clearly, disclosing painful experiences is socially risky. It exposes victims to the gaze and judgment of other people, and empathetic responses are seldom guaranteed. Indeed, sympathy is a minority response. In particular, I think globally, it's really difficult to overestimate the importance of honour. Rather than being conceived of as a public crime, in many places rape was regarded as a private attack on a woman's, and by extension her family's and community's, honour. As such, the family's good name had to be dealt with. This could be done in many, many different ways. It could be done by fathers or husbands dropping charges against alleged rapists, irrespective of the wishes of the victim. Or the complainant might find herself cajoled into marrying her aggressor. This was the case in the US, in Europe, in many South American countries well into the 20th century. In one exploration of statutory rape in New York City between 1896 and 1946, 1 in every 4 prosecutions included attempts to resolve the case through marriage. The emphasis on victims' characteristics, as opposed to, of course, the aggressor's actions, encourages survivors of abuse to blame themselves and to be blamed by others for their own violation. The assumption, which is common in the West, that people live in a just world, bolsters the view that victims must have acted in a way that brought it upon themselves, even if victims could not point themselves to any specific social or moral infraction. Despite this, a wrong must have been committed in order to them to have deserved the abuse. And the strongest version globally of the just world theory can be found in Buddhist beliefs in karma, in, for example, Vietnam, Nepal, Cambodia, where bad events, such as rape, are directly connected to a family's merit and worth, which not only stem from a person's own actions, but those of their family, their previous life, and the lives of their ancestors. Risks emanating from higher authorities in the other world were compounded, of course, by those arising from this world. Reporting abuses to the authorities brought its own dangers. Retaliation by perpetrators or their supporters was a real threat. The short sentences given to sexual assailants who confessed in traditional Rwandan courts was an important reason why many victims were afraid to pursue justice. In conservative Islamic societies, Pakistan, Darfur, for example, reporting rape is especially hazardous. Victims could even be charged with having sex outside of marriage and subjected to penalties such as public whippings or imprisonment. Other practical problems include the fact that throughout the world, sexual predators are the police or governmental officials. In the US, it might even be a man in the highest political office. Although it is often said that poorly trained, under-resourced and corrupt or clientist law enforcement agents are particularly prone to abuse their positions of power within communities. This should not blind us to the high levels of abuse committed by police and prison guards in the affluent West. European police forces have a poor record of sexual abuse. During the 1992-93 war in Bosnia, for example, the civilian police were subject to military authorities, which helps explain their prominent roles in the operation of rape camps. In Northern Ireland, during the Troubles, being seen talking to a policeman was extremely unwise. Similarly, it is simply not an option for Palestinian women in the occupied territories to seek help from the Israeli police. The more vulnerable the population, for example, refugees, asylum seekers, undocumented migrants, the greater the likelihood that they would be sexually exploited by those who are supposed to protect them. In one study of refugees and other undocumented migrants entering Belgium and the Netherlands in the 2010s, it was found that 1/5 of the perpetrators of sexual abuse were reception centre staff, police, lawyers and security guards. The police and military in South Africa are notorious for sexual aggression. Now, it must here be emphasised that a similar statement could be made, for example, about the US police and military. However, my point here is that even though both groups have extremely high levels of sexual abuse, the contexts in which these authorities committed abuses were very different. During apartheid, which lasted until 1994, the South African police and the South African Defence Force routinely detained people without due cause. Indeed, they were explicitly permitted to do so under Section 29 of the 1982 Internal Security Act. 83% of detainees reported being tortured, including having electric shocks to their nipples or genitals. In the face of a policing crisis in South Africa in the late 1980s and 1990s, so-called instant police constables were enrolled in the police force, often being recruited from vigilante groups. After only a few weeks' training, they were sent out to control the townships and other predominantly black neighbourhoods. Very quickly, they gained a reputation for raping vulnerable girls and women. Given that only 1 in 400 rapes that are reported to the South African police in the post-apartheid period ended in a conviction, the risks of reporting abuse were considerably greater than the chances of justice. But there's another aspect I think we need to consider when looking at the sort of protectors as perpetrators dynamic, and that is irrespective of the identity of perpetrators, reporting sexual assaults to the authorities might have the undesirable effect of increasing the presence of police within one's own community. Something, for example, women living in the favelas of Brazil might understandably avoid, preferring instead to enlist the help of local gangs. The fact that the same authorities who were tasked to protect people from harm were perpetrators of such harms is not in fact surprising. After all, the police and other authorities often share misogynist and other prejudices held by the wider population. They might even adhere to more pro-rape attitudes than others. Many police hold inherently violent attitudes to sexuality. They have very different ideas about what constitutes violence, and being accustomed to weapons, they are less intimidated by them and therefore require victims to be less intimidated by them. One study in the 2010s of high-ranking police officers in Delhi found that 90% excused rape victims on the grounds that, excused perpetrators on the grounds that rape victims had been in public places, alone, were dressed inappropriately, or were in some other way deserving of assault. In 2002, the Delhi Police Commissioner, R.G. Gupta, even contended that crimes against women could be halved if women were careful in the way they dress, if they know their limits, and if they do not exercise unsafe behaviour. So in other words, yet again, victims being blamed for their own violation. There were often also very practical constraints for victims seeking help, let alone justice. Victims living in rural or inaccessible regions might be unable to attend police stations or magistrates' courts due to lack of transportation or the inability to take sufficient time, to afford to take the sufficient time off work in order to draw attention of the authorities to their assault. Lack of rape evidence kits or other medical facilities such as refrigerators often meant that bodily samples that could prove the assault were not taken or were incorrectly collected. Accessing adequate police and prosecution services were only the start of a victim's problems. After all, in order to achieve justice, there had to be an identifiable perpetrator, credible witnesses, including the victim herself, and sufficient evidence to warrant the expense of a trial. In the unlikely event of all these factors being present, victims routinely complain that the trial resembles second assault. Defence counsels are intimidating. Victims might be questioned for hours, and unique to rape trials, independent corroboration was required. In no other kind of trial is a witness treated with such high levels of suspicion. Now, this talk only touches the surface of the lack of justice available to victims of sexual abuse. It tells depressing stories of violent authorities, debilitating emotions such as shame, distorted beliefs such as those surrounding ideas about female sexuality, chastity, honour, and a host of other barriers victims of sexual abuse face when attempting to bring their abuse before the public and achieve justice. Not all people who experience sexual harms have their pain acknowledged. Some are seen as less worthy of attention than others. Law and public opinion continues to give moral weight to a victim's chastity. From the moment a person mentions having been sexually abused, attention is paid to the victim's character, the victim's actions, the victim's comportment. Instead of focusing on the behaviour of the abused or the accused, questions are asked about the accuser. Why did she act in particular ways? Why didn't she do this or that? Any action that the victim failed to take is seen as bestowing responsibility. In contrast, the person who perpetrated the abuse is spoken about in the passive voice. Is it any wonder that many victims prefer to bury their dishonour, as Serbian rape victims put it, rather than seek redress? And then things really are getting worse. In the UK today, despite an impressive series of reforms, particularly legal reforms, introduced since the 1970s, the violence continues, and conviction rates now stand between 3 and 4%. So what can be done? Victims, feminists, politicians, lawmakers, police, community activists have debated how sexual violence can be diminished, if not eradicated, for decades. In the next few minutes left to me, it's impossible to do justice to the range of resistances all over the globe. Briefly, however, let me just do a few of these. From the 19th century to the present, many attempts to reduce sexual violence have, I will argue, been unconstructive. Demands that law enforcement agencies must simply lock them up and throw away the key do not work. Victim blaming, an attitude that's embedded in suggestions that women must police their own behaviour, upgrade their security, comport themselves modestly, is still unfortunately common. Too many anti-rape initiatives warn women to avoid dark alleys and short skirts. Advising girls and women to stay at home is equally unhelpful. Household survival often depends upon female labour in the fields, forests and marketplaces, so insisting on purdo is impossible. And, of course, domestic spaces are crowded with abusers anyway. Other proposals make emotional sense but have minimal effect outside the immediate contexts. These include attempts by individual women and men to seek out ways to publicly humiliate their victims, their attackers. 19th century Europe and England, for example, known sexual abusers were often paraded around the village to local jeers, the windows of their homes broken, their credit rejected in the market square. In the contemporary period, Vigilanteism against sexually violent men has also flourished, most notably in India, where the Pink Sari Gang are the world's largest vigilante group, boasting over 20,000 members. Now, although local justice might be gratifyingly retributive, it will never, of course, change a culture of sexualized violence. Most solutions to sexual violence focus on specific aspects of the problem. Lawyers believe in better laws. International relation experts place their faith in interstate agreements. Educationalists place their faith in greater education, and particularly sex education. Some ask, well, is the solution less pornography? Or in fact, is it better pornography? Do we need a return to family values or a celebration of a sensually orientated sexual liberation? Should men parade or march around the streets with placards sporting the problematic slogan, "Hands off our women," or should women do it for themselves, as did Haitian women when they established the Haitian Women's Solidarity? In the late 20th century, support for rape crisis centres has grown, although they've been, of course, chronically underfunded. For example, the Tokyo Rape Crisis Centre was established in 1983, expected to serve all of Japan, but had only 2 telephone lines and was open 3.5 days a week. What we do know is that cultures with sexual equality, higher levels of female economic power and low levels of armed conflict tend to have relatively low levels of rape. We also know that any reduction in sexual violence will require the political, ideological and discursive labour of every global citizen. Sexual violence and the fear of violation are embedded in many people's lives, particularly those of girls, women and minoritized groups. This is not because of any innate tendency in men. It is not only because of socialization. Rape thrives in situations of economic inequality, of structural inequality. Obviously, there's an urgent need to keep reforming the legal system. Obviously, there's an important need for education. But in the final analysis, political attempts to reduce and finally eliminate sexual aggression must start with the main perpetrators. So in other words, rape still does remain the crisis of manliness, and its eradication is a matter for men as well as women. It is we have a need for a radically different conception of agency and masculinity. Thanks very much.
And here we are, joined by our speaker this evening, Professor Joanna Bourke. Thank you very much, Joanna, for that tremendously stimulating talk. Could I ask you a question which has always occurred to me as I've followed your career and read your research and your publications, and that really is, does what you do, does the subject that you cover and the subjects you've covered, does it take a toll of you emotionally and psychologically?
Yes, it does. Obviously, you can't work on this subject and not get emotionally involved in it. I'm reading it literally on a daily basis, quite horrific personal accounts, as well as, medical, legal, police accounts, the whole range. And it does take a toll. I mean, I have been working on violence generally, mainly military violence, for a very long time. So in some senses, sexual violence has come quite late in my sort of list of things I'm really interested in and that I'm writing about. But it takes a toll. I think there are two things actually that are really important here. First is that what got me interested in the topic is precisely the emotional and societal impact of sexual violence. So in a sense, that toll it's taking is a reflection on the society as we're living in it. I mean, when I wrote a book, I think it was around 10 years ago now, I wrote my first history of sexual violence. And at that stage, 1 in 20 cases that got to court ended in conviction, only 1 in 20. If you look at the 1970s, it's 1 in 3. 1980s, it's 1 in 10. Today, it is 1 in 23 cases. So it's got that important sort of kick to it. But that is, of course, emotionally tiring constantly. I think the second response I have to that is actually, I am very fortunate in the sense that I'm working on this distressing topic, but my own personal environment is one of relative privilege. I'm a white middle class, lecturer in history. I'm surrounded by loving men and indeed loving women. So I'm not myself in that risky position. So it is easier for me to switch off. And a lot of people who work in this field can't switch off because they don't have those luxuries.
And the curious dimension for you as well is, as a historian, of course, we're supposed to be open about our sources and to present our findings. I mean, do you feel the need? Do you have to sanitize some of the things that you discover and have uncovered?
I don't sanitize them, but yes, there are lots of things that I don't put out in the public. Graphic accounts, for example. We have to remember that 1 in every 5 of my personal female friends will be sexually assaulted or abused in their lifetime. I don't want to be responsible for, them coming across or something that is graphic and that actually, re-traumatizes them. 1 in 15 of my male friends will also be sexually abused in their lifetime. I want to be in a position where I don't feel like I am part of the problem. So yes, I deliberately don't use very explicit descriptions of the violence that I'm coming across, and equally so images, and quite often images are also really or equally problematic. I mean, we just have to think of those, what I find is really distressing and not showing a lack of respect. Those images of, women with their heads down, and women as the internal victims, and so on the one hand not showing graphic, gruesome images or prose, but on the other hand those cliches which sort of portray girls and women as victims. I also try to avoid those sorts of approaches.
As I expected, we've got some extremely good questions coming in. The first comes from Michael, who asks, how did you establish the threshold for considering an action as violent? And what is it? Voyeurism, conducting an intimate examination that is not clinically needed, causing physical pain and or trauma?
Really, really good question. I think one of the important things when you're working in this field is to listen to what victim survivors are saying. And I'm very clear in my own sort of practice when I'm saying, well, what is violence? What is the violent part of sexual violence, which is basically what you're asking. And the answer to that, as far as my practice, as well as the sort of theoretical framework that I developed very much more in my published work, is that whatever people say is violent is violent. In other words, I'm not there as an historian who works all the way to the present, but I'm still an historian. I work from the early 19th century to the present. What people say is violent is violent. If it is violent for them, that is what it is. And what that kind of definition of violence enables me to do is to problematize it and historicize it. Because it's very clear, if you're working as a historian over a few centuries, more than 2 centuries, that what is regarded as violent has changed dramatically over time. And we can't impose, we shouldn't impose today's conception of what is violent on people in the past. It's clear that when I'm looking at my work, coercion was much more important in designating what was violent in the past. Today, there's a lot more definitions that require or pay attention to psychological or emotional responses, which are defined as violent. This action is violent because it offended me emotionally or psychologically. And indeed, those forms of violence are equally capable of producing the docile body of the rape victim and actually harming our victim survivors.
Thank you. Another question from possibly another Michael. How have societal protections such as ethical guidelines for doctors and the legal framework of laws and precedent evolved?
Yeah, really good. One of the things that interests me is that we have had such dramatic shifts, and I would even use the word improvements, in the legal responses to sexual violence, in protocols that have been introduced in hospitals, clinics, and police, policing services, law enforcement services. And those changes are easily traced and are very, very important. I think what interests me about them is that they haven't really succeeded as well as feminists and other activists had hoped that they would. In other words, coming back to those statistics I gave earlier about the low proportion of cases that reach trial that end in a conviction, and the way that has got worse over the past 25 years, I think is indication that somehow something is going wrong in those protocols and those legal things, that's not enough. Obviously, it's a very important thing that we ought to do and continue, we've done and continue to do. But if we are to solve the problem of the high levels of sexual violence in our communities and globally, we need to go well beyond that.
Do you have hope and ambition that your research has influenced policymaking in various places in the world?
Well, that's for other people to say. Obviously, I do this work, and I have a team, the Shame team, who work on this project. It's a research project funded by the Wellcome Trust. And clearly, our aim, our ambition, if you like, is to affect policy, is to help reduce, if not eradicate, sexual violence. I think one of the things that really dismays me when I'm talking to people about sexual violence is this idea that it's inevitable. that is always going to be there. That's just giving up the fight before we've even really started the fight. I do believe that we can affect change, that there is a better world out there. And indeed, there is evidence that certain societies, both historically and in the present, have low levels of sexual violence. In other words, it's not inevitable. And therefore, it is worthwhile, fighting the good fight to actually make a difference.
On a related matter, we have a question from YouTube. Statistics often indicate that perpetrators repeat offend. Is there not more to be done to address that? And is this is in no way playing down the support we should continually offer victims?
Yeah, I agree absolutely, totally. I think one of the many ways we can tackle this problem is by looking more at perpetrators. One of the things I argue in my book on rape is that attention needs to be paid to the perpetrators. In other words, a lot of attention has been paid to empowering women, which is absolutely necessary, teaching us to fight back. A lot of times, however, that sort of crosses a line to putting both the blame or part of the blame on victim survivors, but also encouraging this really devastating myth that somehow victims deserved it, or somehow they brought it upon themselves by wearing, a short skirt or going out at night. So I think too much emphasis has been placed on this idea of frightening girls and women in particular, so that what do? We sort of lock ourselves up at night. We buy the best locks for our doors. We check all the windows before we go to sleep, and we sit down and we watch, crime films, which inevitably show forms of violence. I think we do need, as you suggest, to fix attention on perpetrators of sexual violence and try to think about what it is that these examples of, if you like, failed masculinity how we can address those issues. And this is not, of course, let me just be very clear about this. This is not to say that men are violent. In fact, masculinity is not that. Unfortunately, there is a tiny proportion that is sexually violent. And these are the people who we need to address and to speak directly to.
Ellie asks, would you determine that in the global south, sexual crimes are regarded as systematic, and in the global north, they are seen as an aberration? If so, is a global framework needed to address this issue, which clearly transcends national borders?
Spot on, absolutely spot on. I mean, I used to be, well, I still am, an historian of Britain and American cultures. And one of the things that just really shocked me when I started to look at the global scene was exactly what you say, that, when we look at sexual violence in the global south, it is about patriarchal cultures. It is about, violent men, violent masculinities, sort of innate to Rwanda or Sierra Leone, etc. And yet when we turn to look at sexual violence in the West, it's about, the bad apple. It's about aberrant individuals. It's about pathologically ill men. And that is something that my current project, current book, which is a global history of sexual violence, is really seeking to address. It's saying, okay, this is actually not only not the case, but it's racist, and it's deeply flawed, and it does not help. In fact, it puts huge barriers up for us to understand just what is happening on a broader level, as well as what is happening within our own cultures.
Absolutely. Question from T. Do you believe the education system could contribute to the mitigation of sexual violence?
Yeah, I do. Sex education has made great advances in recent years. I think that sex education is so important, especially for boys, in trying to address these issues explicitly. It's, one of the things that I really think we need to kind of push is to give boys and men a space where they can talk about these sorts of issues of consent, issues of coercion openly, without fear of, what if I say something that's not politically correct? We need to give a space for people, and for boys and men in particular, to speak about these issues. And there's obvious reasons for that. They are the main perpetrators, but also increasingly they are also the important proportion of them will themselves become victim survivors, and it is often difficult for them to find safe places to talk about issues of sexual violence, of consent, of coercion.
And I think our last question comes from the person who introduced you, my colleague in politics, Matt Davies, who asked a question which relates to all of us, actually. Could you say a few words about how our popular culture addresses sexual violence, for example, in video games or cinema?
Yeah. Do you realize that 1 in 4 Hollywood films has a scene of rape? 1 in 4. That, in other words, rape is being used as a form of titillation to increase audience figures. Online gaming is rife with images and acts of sexual violence. That, this is an area where, each of us as global citizens can actually make an impact by not feeding that kind of popular culture. Now, that said, if we really are serious about reducing, if not eradicating, sexual violence in our community, then this is something for every global citizen. So wherever we are placed, whether we are writers, academics, journalists, mothers, fathers, lawyers, whatever, truck drivers, working in the hospitality industry, there are always things and ways that we can address these issues. And of course, the media is one of these big ways that we can address these issues. But all of us, whatever we do, there's no one answer to this. If we are to be successful, it has to be a concerted effort by as many of us as possible.
And just finally, could you tell us what the outputs, to use a jargon term, are of your projects? You'll be publishing a book, I imagine, on your research.
Yeah, I mean, the book I'm finishing off now, it's due at the end of the year, published by Princeton University Press, is a global history of sexual violence. So, and this is really where my brain is sort of working at the moment. And big issues, not only about how you compare and contrast, but also about ethics. How do you speak about such things in ethical ways that don't end up re-inscribing violence on other peoples? But also, I will also be publishing a book later after this one, which looks at medical and psychiatric aspects of sexual violence, because these are really, really important, both for victim survivors and for the broader communities. That, medicine, one of the first things that happens when a person reports an act of sexual violence is a medical examination. And, there's huge psychological impacts of sexual violence, not only, I hasten to say, on the victims, PTSD, rape trauma syndrome, but also on perpetrators who are also have negative psychological effects by their own violation, which is not to excuse them. It's just to say that, they also are in deeply problematic situations. So the second book actually kind of explores those areas.
Excellent. Thank you very much, then. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'll have to ask you to imagine the applause that will be ringing around the auditorium were we in person. Thank you for giving up your time and enlightening and stimulating our audience this evening, Joanna Bourke. Thank you very much. And our next event will be on Tuesday, the 20th of October, where we will mark Black History Month, as we do every year. And this will be a lecture, A Bittersweet Journey from Slavery to Freedom and Beyond the Colour Line by Dr. Keith McGee. That's on Tuesday. Thank you very much, and hope to see you then.